And I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's J. Sherwood McGinnis Junior War Peace and Justice Project event featuring Colonel retired Perez, Dr. Perez. I appreciate you coming tonight, and I would just ask, we have lots of food, refreshment, and I will not take offense, and I don't think Tino will take offense if you'd like to get up and recharge your glass and fill your plate again for some food. We don't want to take anything home tonight. I'm Scott Buren, co-founder and one of 3 project coordinators for the War, Peace, and Justice Project. Perhaps you were viewing the earlier slides. The project is named after late Dr. Sherwood McGinnis, who passed away prematurely 3 years ago. Matter of fact, next week is his anniversary of his death. And we honored him by naming the project after him. We're blessed to have as our chair, Lieutenant General Jim Dubik, and our senior advisor, General Sir Rupert Smith from the UK. We're very happy to have wonderful partners, Dickinson College, Penn State Dickinson Law School, the Cumberland County Historical Society, who is hosting us this evening, the Carlisle Chamber of Commerce, the Association of the U.S. Army, the Joint Civil Military Network, Interaction Network in Georgia, and participating organizations are the U.S. Army War College and the U.S. Peacekeeping Institute. They've been wonderful supporters, and of course, it's just one example of the great support we get. And they give us use of their space gratis, so we're just incredibly thankful. These are wonderful facilities. Couple administrative notes: if you have to use the restrooms, they're out the back door there. Just turn right, go all the way down the hallway, and take another right and find them on the left-hand side. A little bit about the War, Peace, and Justice Project. This is a project that began just prior to COVID. We unfortunately had to postpone 3 times a symposium that finally kicked it off in 2022. We've had over 35 events. Next week, we're hosting George Washington and the slave valet, William Lee from Colonial Williamsburg, both are nation builders. They'll be accompanied by author Jeffrey Finnegan, author of the I Knew George Washington series. They'll be here at 6:30 next Tuesday here in this very room, and then Wednesday at 12:30 at the Bosler Library. They've been here at a summer fair, and they're being brought back by popular demand. So they're incredible. They're enrolled in costume, and it's like going back in time. The purpose of the War, Peace, and Justice Project is to illuminate the drama of human conflict and war's impact on society, mainly our veterans and their families, but also on indigenous populations that are unfortunately trapped in conflicts around the world. Tonight's special one is a colleague and friend who I was introduced to several years ago, and I'm going to point out Angela Smith. So this is not my first time working with Tino, but we're so happy that he asked us if he could present, and we are just absolutely elated, and I'm sure tonight's will at least equal yesterday's presentation, but perhaps even surpass. Again, please help yourself during the presentation if you want more food and refreshment. A little bit about Tino. Most of you know, because many of our students here in Tino's classroom at the War College. But for those of you who don't know, Colonel Perez, Dr. Perez, I have to read this, and every time I read it, I shrink a couple inches. So bear with me. Tino Perez is the chair of executive and strategic leadership at the U.S. Army War College. He also serves as an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. And so we're happy that you made it back tonight from that event you had today at Columbia. His research interests include leader development, political judgment, strategy, military ethics, and the relationship between the American military and democracy. Very topical. He is especially interested in bridging the gap between political science and the real-world challenges that political and military leaders confront, Dr. Perez holds a BS in American politics from West Point, 1992, and a Master's of Arts, 2002, and a Ph.D., 2008 in political science, political theory, from Indiana University at Bloomington. He's a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Army War College with a master's in strategic studies. His scholarly work appears in the Journal of Military Ethics, Peace Review, Armed Forces and Society, Perspectives on Politics, and Higher Education Skills and Work-Based Learning. His public and professional essays have appeared in Joint Forces Quarterly, Military Review, War on the Rocks, Political Violence at a Glance, and The Strategy Bridge. He has also published an edited volume entitled Addressing the Fog, the Center of Gravity, Perspectives on the Center of Gravity in U.S. Military Doctrine and Combat Studies Institute Press, 2012. On October 31st, 2021, Colonel Perez retired as a colonel after 30 years of distinguished service in the U.S. Army. He served as an armor officer and strategist with key assignments as a task force commander in Iraq, a speechwriter and a strategic advisor in Afghanistan, and as the director of plans at U.S. Army North in San Antonio, Texas. His previous teaching assignments include service at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in the Department of Social Sciences and at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College as director of the Local Dynamics of War Scholars Program. Tino, forgive me, I had to do it. I am so proud to have you as a colleague and a friend, and we're elated again for you to be here. Without any further ado, Dr. Tino Perez.
Thank you very much for coming tonight. My roles as educator, as a scholar, and as a former military professional are the motivations for giving the talk today. I want to talk about the wars that we participated in as a country in the 21st century in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't think in those three roles that we have done enough introspection and reflection on how we could have done things better if things could have gone in a different direction, especially in Afghanistan, but I believe also in Iraq. Focusing on Afghanistan, there are several reasons that people give for the strategic discontent that arose in the wake of our departure, the U.S. departure from Afghanistan. One of them being Afghanistan's proximity to Pakistan, which allowed fighters from the enemy to cross the border and enjoy sanctuary there, and then come back and attack later on. Another one was poor strategic planning. My mentor, Bob Cassidy, called it, using Barbara Tuchman's term, wooden-headedness across several presidential administrations. So that was one of the reasons. There's just poor strategic and policy decision-making. Another one advocated by people called Coindinistas. These are people who are fans of counterinsurgency. They'll say that, well, the U.S. and the soldiers weren't committed to doing counterinsurgency, full bore, 100% dedicated to that approach to fighting. And then some people will blame our allies, for example, Germany. Well, they controlled one of the regional commands in Afghanistan, and they didn't put their soldiers out of patrol in order to get closer to people, receive tips on where the enemy was, etc. I'm not here to contest any of those explanations, but I want to offer a complementary explanation, one that I simply don't hear, which is that given the strategy and the policy aims that we were pursuing, we being the United States and citizens of the federal government, we put soldiers, sailors, and Marines in a difficult situation on the ground. When we send soldiers, and I'm talking soldiers, broadly speaking, service members, to war, we train them to use their weapons, and I'm going to be graphic because we're talking about war, to kill enemy, and we train these soldiers to defend themselves. This is the basics of what a soldier does. But what we ask soldiers to do in Afghanistan and Iraq was something totally different, which was to practice politics in the maximum sense possible, which is where you have coalition building by leaders to assemble a group to combat another group. Sometimes this happens peacefully with institutions, for example, the American government. But ultimately, violence is a part of politics. And what happens is that two entities, two groups of people fight each other. Well, when we make decisions about whom to target as enemies and who to befriend as allies, these are political decisions that political leaders make. And we evaluate those decisions with something called jus ad bellum, just war theory. When soldiers fight, we evaluate them in terms of jus in bello. It's another part of just war theory, which is ensuring, broadly speaking, that they're targeting enemy combatants and not civilians on the ground. But what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan is we asked these soldiers to play politics, to be full-bore political leaders. And what I'm going to do today is read, I hope vividly so you stay awake, anecdotes from these service members on the ground describing their experience. And what I think you'll carry away from it is a sense of how dismayed they were in the environment in which they found themselves. So this is what I want to bring to the fore. It's not what I'm hearing about. There's an Afghan War Commission. I hope that somehow they stumble upon these soldiers' testimony and they honor it. We should honor it. So I'm going to go to my computer. I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'll come back and give you some ideas. Stay with me, okay? I'll begin with the preamble here. My overarching normative aim is by weaving together the scattered perspectives of soldiers' wartime experiences to craft the causal story I have yet to see or hear, to foreground the predicament of military leaders who had to practice politics amidst violence, albeit without the concepts and theory necessary to reflect on and prepare for this high-stakes political work ahead of time. And finally, to invite senior political and military leaders to explain how, in hindsight, they would craft policies, strategies, and military plans to succeed amidst kaleidoscopic deception and violence. I'll explain what that is. My starting position is that the answers are inexorably fugitive. Whether the answers exist or not, we should not only think what we are doing during wartime interventions, we must also think what we have done, whether as policymakers, citizens, scholars, or service members. Someone can give up a hand. The argument in broad is that in a counterinsurgency, the principal problem is the identification problem. We have to identify who the enemy is because they look like everybody else. Well, what I'm going to argue is that there's an overlooked problem, which I'm going to call the positional problem. And that's what I will explain. In short, given alliance switching that occurs in a counterinsurgency, how does a counterinsurgent position his or her forces on the ground to succeed in a mission? So I describe and theorize this problem, and then I'll give you some implications. Now, there's some persons here who aren't interested, who are probably don't have intimate knowledge of the military. So let me give you a little preamble. Let's assume that we in this room are soldiers for Iraq. We're wearing uniforms. And for whatever reason, we want to take over Newell. And in Newell at the moment, there's another meeting going on, and those persons are wearing different uniforms. And they, for some reason, want to take over Carlisle. And we get a sense that they're going to launch a mission against us. They get a sense that we're going to launch a mission against them. And somehow we're going to meet between Newell and Carlisle. It could be in the woods. It could be on a highway. It could be in a residential area. The problem in this sort of conventional war where two sides are wearing uniforms is finding where the enemy is. Once we find them, we know who they are because they're wearing uniforms. It's very easy. But how do we find them? And then once we found them, how do we use our weapon systems against them in an effective way to accomplish our mission? This is a conventional war. I call it here the weapons and deployment problem in interstate war, a war between two states. In civil wars, we have a different situation. Within a single country, there's a group of armed actors not wearing uniforms in many cases. Sometimes they are, but in most cases they're not. In Iraq and Afghanistan, they were not. And what they're trying to do is take over the government. So they're citizens of the country, but they want to take over the government and obviously change the form of government, enact different policies, etc. They don't wear uniforms. So the whole problem for counterinsurgents, the soldiers who are working for the government, is to figure out who is the insurgent. Because it could be 5 of you in this room, but I don't know who you are because you look like everybody else. So the problem for civil wars is the identification problem. There's investigations involved. But what I'm going to read to you later is accounts of how individual citizens, individual fighters holding weapons, entire communities, entire armed groups, and government officials, to include political leaders at various levels, are actually switching sides. They're changing allegiances routinely. Yet the American counterinsurgent has to hew to the mission, which is to advance the government's aims, to defend the government from being taken over. The counterinsurgents can't switch sides, but everybody else is. And it makes things difficult. So now if I'm a counterinsurgent, I put myself on the ground, I get out of my up armored Humvee, and I'm patrolling the area, I have to wonder who's friend, who's enemy, and who's going to be friend and enemy tomorrow, because it's going to change. What are the motives? So this is the positional problem in civil wars. Wesley Morgan, a journalist and former U.S. Marine, describes Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Ryan's bewilderment with the socio-political landscape in Afghanistan's Kashmir Valley. Instead of a simple bipolar struggle, that is, government versus insurgency, government versus insurgency, a bipolar struggle between government forces and an insurgency, Ryan describes a complex obstacle course comprising on and off understandings between government forces and the Taliban, as well as infighting and changing allegiances among militants. Ryan explains, it's Kunan. People and groups are going to waffle and flip-flop and trade sides and do what they need to do in the short term, but not much is going to change in the long term. Within this environment of rampant deception and alliance switching, American and coalition counterinsurgents must rely on intuition and personal judgments to discern the various actors' motivations for supporting one side or another, switching allegiances, or adopting an apparent position of neutrality. These leaders must ask, what motives drive these actors' alliance postures? Morgan explains how Ryan, serving as a battalion commander, wasn't convinced that he or his troops or any other Americans understood enough about what was going on within the complex coalition of insurgent factions in the Pesh to definitively conclude that any particular change in the guerrillas' behavior was a result of U.S. actions. Did the presence of U.S. forces even matter? Ryan was unable to link his and his unit's actions to the behavior of the various other actors on the ground. Do some local actors' seemingly unfriendly actions betray a focused hatred of the counterinsurgents? Do other local actors' seemingly friendly actions testify to a focused affinity for the government? Is a counterinsurgent's existence peripheral to local actors' decision-making? Do local actors simply exploit in different ways the counterinsurgents' gullibility and power? Morgan quotes Brian Halstead, a chief warrant officer with the U.S. Special Forces, who explains, quote, a lot of us were left to make our own decisions. Was the guy who'd been Taliban tainted forever? What did it mean that he'd been Taliban? Had he just accepted the Taliban and the government and that was it? What if he fought the Taliban before that, end of quote. Although counterinsurgents proceeded as if their chief problem was to unveil and then kill or capture insurgents, some ground level leaders struggled, whether mindfully or not, to understand the socio-political landscape's complexity and especially the various armed and unarmed actors and motives. Jason Dempsey, I taught with Jason Dempsey at West Point. Jason Dempsey, a political scientist and former American counterinsurgent, recalls his unique surprise when a putative enemy insurgent whom his soldiers had detained in Kunar was promptly released. Dempsey, reflecting on this incident and the opacity of Afghan politics, writes, "There was little chance of gaining an understanding of local politics. In the soup of reported terrorist and insurgent organizations, we could barely figure out whom we would even be fighting. In retrospect, it didn't matter. The fact is we were going to lump all our enemies together and ignore the politics anyway." The insurgent, whom Dempsey's soldiers had sent via helicopters to a detention facility in Bagram, instead landed at the Afghan president's palace in Kabul. The targeted insurgent was a political ally of the Afghan president. Counterinsurgent leaders had to wonder whether the enemy fighter they were trying to kill or detain was authentically and enduringly an enemy actor, and the outburst, whether a government supporting citizen or fighter was authentically and enduringly a friendly actor. In the summer of 2007, Iraqi Sunni fighters in West Baghdad's Amaria neighborhood, led by Abu Ahmed, had broken their alliance with Al-Qaeda. So Sunni Iraqis fighting with Al-Qaeda, broke alliance with Al-Qaeda, and joined forces with the Americans. As the Sunni fighters prepared for a combat operation with American soldiers, a bizarre scene ensued. So imagine a bunch of Bradley fighting vehicles lined up here, and soldiers are getting ready to go on a mission, and they're being joined now by these former Sunni insurgents who are now allies. Quote, "Some of the fighters donned black ski masks as they deployed for security operations atop the American soldiers' Bradley fighting vehicles." Joel Rayburn and Frank Sobchak, the authors of the U.S. Army's two-volume history of the Iraq War, quoted one American officer reflecting on these now allied Sunni fighters' menacing, insurgent-hinged appearance and tactical prowess. Who are these guys? Really? Convenient, deception-fueled alliances between local citizens and counterinsurgents are common. Counterinsurgents rely upon local actors to provide tips, revealing the identities and locations of enemy fighters. Yet Morgan's account describes how local actors' motives for providing these tips are mixed and not aligned with the counterinsurgents' aim to unveil insurgents and terrorists. Local actors would accuse or denounce their rivals, whether personal, business, or political, for being insurgents. That neighbor's dog keeps peeing in my lawn. Now we have a war. That's the Taliban right there. Go pick them up. We'll get rid of the dog food. This is the kind of thing that was actually being thought of. In some cases, according to a CIA paramilitary officer, people were just making up stories because they knew we paid for it. Counterinsurgents assume that local actors who provide tips are authentically and enduringly friendly actors within a bipolar landscape. In reality, these local actors negotiating a kaleidoscopic obstacle course are simply exploiting the temporary association with powerful insurgents. So the kaleidoscope images come up a few times. In official counterinsurgency thinking for the US military, we view the landscape as a mosaic. So picture a mosaic with stones depicting some art form. But the stones are static. It is complex. They're varied. And we have to understand the different languages at play, the different religions, the different secularities, the forms of government, the ways of thinking, the ideologies. That composes the mosaic. But the image I want you to have is not of a mosaic, but of a kaleidoscope. Where you look at the kaleidoscope, you still have little stones, but then you turn it. And the configuration changes. And so you have an imaginary line where one side is the insurgency, the other side is supporting the government. Today, you turn it, the line is in place, but now the configuration of the stones changes. This is what these soldiers were describing. This is what I mean by kaleidoscopic dynamics. Rayburn and Sobchak alluding to the awakening wherein several Sunni tribes in Iraq broke their alliance with Al-Qaeda to join counterinsurgents, describe the nature of local dynamics. These are two historians, but also they are soldiers. The awakening made clear that the lines between insurgents, provincial and national governments, tribes, and security forces were not as distinct as coalition units typically assume. One of the awakening's chief architects behind the scenes, Mohammed Mahmoud Latif, was himself a prominent insurgent leader. While many tribes intermittently supported or opposed the insurgency as the political winds shifted one way or another, Iraqi motivations were often quite localized as tribes came under Al-Qaeda, enticement or threat to their personal safety, and economic livelihood. Alliances of convenience, fueled by local motives related to survival, status, wealth, resources, and power, complicate simple framings of the Iraq War as a bipolar static landscape. James A. Russell provides a more nuanced explanation for certain tribes' decisions to fight Al-Qaeda in Iraq. He writes, one militia participant, a welder named Ahmed Al-Ibab, seemed to capture the mood of the period in stating, we are a group of the Anbar people who want to get rid of Zarqawi, the leader of Al-Qaeda. Because this is the only way to make the Americans withdraw from Ramadi or Iraq in general. Cooperating with American counterinsurgents in this case did not equate to the militia fighters' desire for an authentic and enduring alliance with American forces or the Iraqi government, but merely the first of a two-step plan to rid Iraq of American presence. Colin Jackson recounts the difficulties U.S. Marines in Afghanistan faced in trying to secure Marja in Afghanistan's Helmand province. Viewing the fight as a bipolar contest, the Americans stumbled into a maelstrom of local motives and political violence. Jackson quotes Stanley McChrystal, the top coalition four-star commander in Afghanistan at the time, proclaiming confidently, we have government in a box, ready to roll in. Jackson, in his own words, tells a different story. In practice, the attempt to install Afghan administrators and restore public services collided with existing tribal politics. Even well-intentioned efforts to restore the city's irrigation systems provoked violent conflicts over water access and political power. Afghan local police, Afghanistan's analog to the police recruitment programs American and coalition soldiers established in Iraq, comprised armed fighters vetted by local leaders and equipped by counterinsurgents to protect local residents, like a volunteer police force here in Colorado. Theo Farrell describes the motive of one Afghan local police commander in Helmand. Lal Mohammed, known as Lali, was related by marriage to the local Taliban commander. So here's the police working for the government, related to local Taliban commander, a fellow Perez tribe. Such familiar links across the divide were common in Helmand. When a dispute with a local Nurzai warlord escalated to threaten Lali, he defected to the Taliban, taking with him intimate knowledge of Afghan police strengths and weaknesses in the area. In the foregoing instances, alliance switching behavior puzzled or surprised the counterinsurgents. Wesley's protagonists, Ryan and the CIA paramilitary officer, having witnessed alliance switching in Afghanistan's firsthand, evinced humility as they explicitly acknowledged both the centrality alliance switching played in the landscape and the opacity of the motives that drive local actors to switch alliances. So I'm going to switch now. I've described one part of the positional problem, which is how do you make sense of the motives driving people to switch allegiance? That's the first problem. The second problem is position. I'm going to tell a story now about Brad Brown, who I taught with at U.S. Military Academy in the Department of Social Sciences, and I'll tell you more about him a little bit later. The journalist Greg Jaffe relates the predicament of Brown, a squadron commander in eastern Afghanistan, who worked diligently to understand the motives of one of his two principal adversaries, Mullah Sadiq. The lieutenant colonel knew that Sadiq had once cooperated with American forces. Moreover, Sadiq's armed group was simultaneously fighting another rebel force, which Brown denominated as radical Taliban. Brown, seeking to discern Sadiq's motives, declared, the bad guys aren't bad because they were born bad. What no one ever teaches you is how to get to the bottom of the story. No one ever teaches you to ask, why is Mullah Sadiq the way he is? So Brad Brown, had studied policy at the LBJ School of Government at the University of Texas. He had taught at West Point. He had already served as a tactical level leader in Iraq as a counterinsurgent. And then later on, he went back to Iraq to serve on the 3-4 staff. So he saw insurgency from the ground level and also from the headquarters level. He was about as well prepared a counterinsurgent as you could have. He understood politics in a certain way, and he understood military counterinsurgency. But he's saying here, what no one ever teaches you is how to understand why someone's motives are what they are. Well, Lieutenant Colonel. Jeffy describes how the vast majority of Brown's time was spent quizzing Afghan elders and officials on decades-old tribal disputes and intrigues. In the evenings, he scoured the internet for information on the Hague, which is, I'm not going to pronounce that, but it's the group that's Sadiq led, and its history in Nuristan province during the Soviet era. Jeffy describes how Brown's persistent study of Sadiq's motives led to the formulation of 3 hypotheses. So here we're going to see the positional problem in action. First, Brown concluded that Sadiq's armed group was moderate, while the other group firing at Brown soldiers comprised radicals. The moderates you could perhaps switch, the radicals couldn't. The second hypothesis, it was Brown's own American and Afghan forces' presence in the remote mountains to unify the moderate and radical groups against American and Afghan soldiers. If Brown could manage to withdraw his forces, Sadiq's moderate forces and the radical Taliban fighters might focus on fighting each other. The third hypothesis, Brown might then be able to win Sadiq to the Afghan government side via inducements, by providing Sadiq with money, truck, and political support. Now, if you could show me where this political activity of coalition building, maneuvering, the contingent selection of allies and enemies, that is contingent because it could be otherwise by another commander. If you could show me where that is in counterinsurgency thinking, or in the preparations for war that these units went through, or even, this is the worst, in reflections of those 2 wars, I'll pay you $100. This is tying hands to my students. This is a bold declaration. Jaffe's journalistic account reveals that Brown was not simply attempting to unveil the identities of fighters who composed a discrete set of rebels, but otherwise, he was not simply trying to solve the identification problem. Brown was instead seeking to discern how best to position his forces within a landscape replete with opaque motives and shifting alliances, while also fulfilling 2 pressing obligations. The obligation to conduct a counterinsurgency campaign in support of the Afghan government, he can't flip-flop, and the obligation to exercise due diligence regarding how best to employ his soldiers. He wants to bring as many home safely as possible. Let me give you a few more examples. Sarah Chase describes the decisions of American Special Forces officers in Afghanistan who had befriended as an ally Gul al-Shirzai, simultaneously a warlord and the governor of Kandahar province. Through Shirzai's manipulation of the Special Forces gullibility, he used his relationship with the Americans to pursue vengeance against his personal and political rivals. Shirzai also led the Americans to marginalize some tribal leaders who could have been genuine partners to the Americans. Shirzai's manipulation nearly led the Americans to assassinate, at Shirzai's request, Shir Mahmad, the governor of Helmand, and a political rival of Shirzai's. Che's assessment of one military officer's judgment is especially severe. This is Che's word too. That such an exclusive relationship with a single local player in treacherous Afghanistan makes the army vulnerable to manipulation apparently never crossed this officer's mind. It seemed to be with pride did he confirm the extent of Shirzai's monopoly. Everything that happens in this province goes through the government, he proclaimed. We don't trust the others. Theo Farrell tells a similar story. U.S. Special Forces made matters worse through their clumsy operations to hunt down Taliban in Helmand. Many locals mistaken for Taliban by American commandos, were carted off to Guantanamo Bay for years of imprisonment. Some of those unfortunates were handed over to the Americans by unscrupulous tribal and business rivals. Soldiers are trained in the skills of enemy engagement, this is chase, battlefield tactics, military planning, not politics and diplomacy. Superb observation. Ground level leaders may approach the positional problem with due diligence or not. Tactical leaders' designations of allies and enemies can be done well and responsibly or poorly and irresponsibly. I want to take a moment. I'm not here to criticize in a sort of ethical or professional way the soldiers that I'm describing here. The reason that they're not susceptible of critique is because we as citizens and the government didn't train them to do this work. It was nowhere in anyone's imagination that they would be doing this work, even after several years. But now we have no excuse, because Wesley Morgan's written his book, Sarah Chase has written her book, and others have written their books. Our obligation as military professionals, as citizens, as policymakers, is to read those books and become familiar with how war actually played out in the 21st century thus far, and not make the same mistakes again. Despite his abundant, talking about Brad Brown again, despite his abundant research into Sadiq's history and the region's politics, Brown concluded, there is so much here that is opaque to us. He added, honestly, I'm speculating about the motives about someone I have never met or talked to. If Brown exemplifies due diligence in confronting the positional problem, Chase depicts the special forces in southern Afghanistan as exercising too little due diligence and displaying too much gullibility in their selection of friends and foes. And this is the big question. Perhaps with adequate preparation, the special forces may have dampened their gullibility and amplified their circumspection during operations. Or perhaps the political challenges were insurmountable. The question becomes, could we have succeeded in Afghanistan? Journalistic and military accounts reveal how prevalent the positional quandaries that Brown and the special forces encountered were throughout Iraq and Afghanistan. For example, Sean McFarland, at the time a U.S. brigade commander, Army colonel, and Neil Smith, a major, described how their brigade's efforts engendered the Anbar Awakening in Iraq, during which waves of Sunni Iraqi fighters switched from being foes to friends of the Americans. McFarland's tactics included co-opting specific local leaders to exert their influence on behalf of the counterinsurgents, the establishment of tribal militias, and the recruitment of local sheikhs. McFarland and Smith write, the brigade staff believed that by offering convincing incentives, we could create a tribal alliance that could produce lasting security in Ramadi. Whereas Wesley Morgan describes Joseph Ryan's bewildered inability to attribute actors' behavior in his area of operations in Afghanistan to his unit's actions, McFarland and Smith, at least in this early account of the Anbar Awakening in Iraq, express much more certainty. Quote, but the change that led to the defeat of Al-Qaeda in Ramadi, what some have called the Gettysburg in Iraq, was not a random event. It was a result of a concerted plan executed by U.S. forces in Ramadi. It was far-sighted senior leaders, Iraqi and American, who improved Iraq's security situation. That's bold confidence. We'll get back to that in a moment.
That was phrase.
William Mullen, a U.S. Marine Battalion commander, and Daniel Green, a U.S. Navy tribal and leadership engagement officer, described their own contingent decisions in Iraq's Fallujah as the practice of weaponized politics. Weaponized politics, what they call it. Green writes, I wanted to shape local decisions. This is a staff officer. I wanted to shape local decisions through discrete actions on my own to bolster our friends and sanction our opponents. I wanted to weaponize politics and use it to defeat the local insurgency. Green adds, we had to support the mayor more assertively and stitch together the various pieces of local government more tightly while marginalizing the Fallujah tribal chiefs council. This is pure politics. Green's co-author, Mullen, this is the commander, provides an example of a contingent decision to marginalize a local leader, Abu Bakr. Mullen describes how he had begun to take steps to limit Abu Bakr's impact on the meetings themselves. Whenever he would stand up to address the council, I would start to rebut everything he would bring up. After the first couple of times I challenged him in the council's presence, he stopped speaking, and his attendance at the meeting soon became sporadic. Whereas previous commanders had opted to support Abu Bakr, Mullen decided that this local leader and potentially armed actor was now a threat to the counterinsurgency efforts. Ultimately, Mullen's efforts prompted Abu Bakr to flee Iraq. The authors do not say what became of Abu Bakr or those Iraqi citizens whom he represented. Was Abu Bakr an authentic enemy? Were his followers enemies? Or was Abu Bakr merely an inconvenient impediment to the American military leader's vision? And this inconvenience is part of politics. We have to overcome it. The scholar Christian Tripodi is less optimistic about the ability of service members to practice weaponized politics, or as he calls it, political warfare. In fact, Tripodi describes how McFarland, going back to Sean McFarland, in an interview that postdates his co-written paper with Smith, expresses much more uncertainty about his unit's role in Anbar awakening. McFarland freely acknowledged that he lacked an understanding of the true motivations of those he was engaging with, admitting that the awakening was a Sheikh's idea and I just went with it. Put otherwise, McFarland's decisions about how to position his forces and whom to designate as allies and enemies were suffused with uncertainty and humility. Tripodi finds that McFarland's uncertainty to have been pervasive. The lack of understanding concerning the motivations of those with whom they, American counterinsurgents, were engaging was a revealing dimension of the awakening. Tripodi finds it is difficult to escape the conclusion that in significant ways, U.S. and British military efforts in Anbar and Basra during the period under examination were often peripheral to the events that unfolded. Tripodi describes the efforts of Andrew McKay, a British brigadier with a cultivated enthusiasm to implement U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine and insights from behavioral economics, while battling the Taliban in Helmand province, Musakali. This is kind of reflective on this for a moment. So, a brigadier, Andrew McKay, became a fan of counterinsurgency in the same way that people today are becoming a fan of certain political parties throughout the world, in the United States. This is not a healthy situation. To become an advocate of a way of war, a coinonista, is an interesting enthusiasm to cultivate. And then again, to pretend that you've mastered behavioral economics to the degree that you can now play at it during war is something that I would advise humility. After defeating the local Taliban, McKay sought to emplace a just defeated Taliban commander as a district governor. So he just defeated him. Now he wants to put him as a governor. McKay's aim was to reintegrate a former and influential Taliban leader named Mullah Salam, who sought to defect to the acting government side. Hoping to split the local insurgency, British political leaders and Afghan President Hamid Karzai approved of McKay's decision. The problem was that there were two local persons named Mullah Salam, and McKay had selected the wrong person, a small-scale and ineffectual militia commander with little purchase on local politics. The unfolding dynamics proceeded from the adverse selection of Mullah Salam, as well as his incompetence and rivalry with prominent local actors, led to the local population's exploitation and suffering. The population were worse off because of the continued selection of friends by American, in this case, a coalition source. If Andrew McKay had erred in selecting a former Taliban leader to recruit as an ally, Theo Farrell describes how U.S. Special Forces had erred in designating their enemies. Special Forces began offering $2,000 for the capture of Al-Qaeda terrorists and Taliban fighters. But the Special Forces failed to account for former Taliban fighters who had long since switched allegiances to the government side. Farrell writes, some years later, a number of local elders and Taliban commanders from across the province attested that as a result, many former Taliban returned to the insurgency in self-defense. Examples include Mullah Esanullah, a former Taliban district commander in Helmand, and Mullah Akhtar Mohammed Mansour, a former Taliban aviation and tourism minister in Kandahar. The former had surrendered all his weapons, and the latter had received amnesty from President Hamid Karzai. Yet, seeing the danger arising from U.S. Special Forces' misguided pursuits, Essendova and Mansour returned to the Taliban as rebel leaders. So here we're doing fine. Phil Clyde, whom you should read, K-L-A-Y, Phil Clyde, a U.S. Marine veteran, tells the story of Ian Fishback. Ian Fishback is another name you should look in on the internet. A Special Forces major stationed in Iraq's Diyala province. In the wake of a mortar attack on his base that killed 2 U.S. service members, Fishback arranged to meet the Sheikh, whom he thought had either knowledge of or directed the fatal mortar attack. The major saw his job less as one of pacifying an insurgency than working out some sort of settlement between competing groups that would allow them to live together peacefully. The process was primarily political. Hence, instead of following the routine American practice of detaining the Sheikh, Fishback employed a lighter touch. Fishback warned the Sheikh during a meeting that if the base suffered more mortar attacks, Fishback would no longer consider the Sheikh and he to be friends. Fishback's description of his role as a counterinsurgent approximates what I described as a positional problem. These are his words. The exercise of power means not dominating an external world, but weaving yourself into a web of relationships in such a way that those around you begin making choices that take your wants and desires into account. This means that power, ultimately, is not about control. It is about submitting to a complex system that is out of any one person's control. This is a tremendously sophisticated approach to counterinsurgency. I have several anecdotes here, but I have to imagine, having been there, that the dynamics I'm describing were going on in perhaps hundreds of places in Iraq and Afghanistan over a period of years. But we only know those that we're able to get reflection of, writing about. This was excellence. Whether he succeeded or failed, it was mindful attention, due diligence to the task at hand. Is it possible that in the counterinsurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan, for them to have succeeded, we were relying upon heroes, sophisticated, mindful heroes in those countless innumerable locations throughout Iraq and Afghanistan, if we're going to have a chance to succeed? And it's a sober question, because you can't, as military people know, base a plan on heroes. You have to base it on normal people, where the fog and friction of war existed. People are going to do stupid things, and they're going to fail. That's what our plans have to be. Although Fishback was unsure about whether his positional decision was the right one, he was hopeful. I think he did well for the people. Fishback's approach appears thoughtfully responsible and appreciative of this landscape. Moreover, his actions reveal a sense of obligation to dismiss the simplistic, bipolar counterinsurgency doctrine. There's a woman counterinsurgent. She's now an author outside of the military realm. Her name is Ginny Hall, and she wrote a dissertation about key leader engagements. Key leader engagements are what commanders did when they went to go visit important members of the communities, whether in Afghanistan or Iraq. And what she describes in her study of key leader engagements is that there's a distinction to be made between real leaders in the society and then artificial leaders. And what the U.S. was doing through key leader engagements was creating and elevating artificial leaders. These persons would give themselves title like Sheikh and Mukhtar, etc., in order to give themselves a presence to the global Americans and other coalition partners. And so many of them spoke English. So if you have people who can speak English in society, Americans and coalition partners are going to gravitate to them. Even though it could be what I teach students, adverse selection. They could be the bad guys, but they speak English, so you feel comfortable. Whereas there are people in the society who don't speak English, but would be good partners in this counterinsurgency, but you'll never know who they are. They have a signaling problem. hey, we can help you. But we have no way of communicating that to you. What happened during these particular engagements was we would give contracts, money, $1,000 for these various numbers, these artificial leaders, and some of them perhaps authentic, to do contract work for the coalition. We did this thinking that they would switch sides to the government, authentic and enduring supporters of the government, counterinsurgency. But when the spigot was turned off, what happened is the attacks went back up. And they explicitly threatened if the money wasn't turned on, they were going to go back to supporting the insurgency. It's money. It's not allies or friends or counterinsurgency or insurgency. It's money in this case. There's also interesting dynamics that you find. McFarlane was the one, the Gettysburg in Iraq. He selected a leader, al-Sitar, a mid-range tribal leader in the area, to befriend and to elevate in importance. And he was going to be the linchpin of the MR awakening in his area. But there was a two-star general above McFarlane. And that two-star general didn't like what McFarlane was doing with al-Sitar. What the two-star general wanted was to ally with former Iraqi leaders who were the actual real leaders, but they were in Jordan. So you see this tug of war going on between different hierarchies within the US government. But it's interesting what McFarlane says. So there's critiques of what he's doing, not only in the headquarters, but also in the population. And here's how he responds. Those were valid concerns. I don't belittle them at all. But it did make it a little bit more challenging for me to try to make sure that the Marine leadership in Anbar understood that these guys, the Rawali Sheikhs, really can be trusted. And on what basis was that decision made? I'll finish with one last example, and I'll give you some examples, some implications about here. Aaron McLean, who fought as a U.S. Marine in the Battle of Marja, describes how violence began to subside in the fall of 2010. McLean questions, had the people finally recognized the Kabul government as legitimate and chosen it over the Taliban who ruled as thugs only through coercion, as a coin, the counterinsurgency manual possibly? So he's asking, was the narrative that Perez and others were giving us, is that what happened here? He contrasted this bipolar counterinsurgency narrative with by now familiar story. Marine officers began to reduce levels of violence by buying off local power brokers directly. The initiative was inspired less by counterinsurgency field manual and more by television series like The Sopranos and The Wire. The initiative entailed Marines hiring Afghan locals, ostensibly, to guard things like wells, mosques, and markets from insurgents. But in fact, this was a variation on a much older practice, paying tribes not to attack. The money distributed initially to local leaders, who were also in the opium trade, was likely distributed to the various patronage and smuggling networks and the Taliban. McLean explains how that a follow-on program, the Afghan local police, engendered similar incentives among the local Afghan leaders. The program entailed raising tribal militias to fight the Taliban, just as had occurred during the Iraq awakening movement. These newly formed militias in Afghanistan were often constituted by the same people who had been fighting ISAF, the U.S. military and coalition, and the government only months before. McLean quotes a Marine officer with 2 tours of Marja on the dynamics of patronage. Quote, what actually secured Marja was not that the Afghan government established its legitimacy, but that it became more lucrative to work with the government and the Marines than it did to continue to participate in the poppy trade or work with Taliban elements. End of quote. Moreover, by intentionally overpaying for contracts, we were able to hire all the former fighters over to the government side. Okay, that's enough of the anecdotes. You get a sense of the dismay of these soldiers suffered under. Again, I'm not hearing these accounts come to the fore, so I thank you for listening and allowing me to bring these to the fore. There's an enthusiasm right now for a regular warfare. In the Pentagon, in Washington DC, the principal concern is how do we defeat, God forbid, the People's Republic of China if we have to go to war. That's the concern in Washington DC. And there's a question as to how can a regular war, and some experts are in the room here in my class, how can a regular war and expertise in it contribute? But in these discussions, as also in the discussions about what we learned from Iraq, they certainly don't see the deep reflection on soldiers' experiences at the ground level and how that affects strategy and how that affects policy leaders. Another concern is that political scientists, many of them women, are doing great research, collecting a lot of data, applying sophisticated techniques of analysis to that data, and describing civil wars throughout space and time in the very way that these soldiers discovered. How much of that literature do you think actually seeps into military education? I can tell you not much at all. And then finally, I'll leave you with this. We're thinking about a war we want to avoid with the People's Republic of China. We also talk about Russia sometimes. And the idea is that we no longer can do these small wars. We want to forget about them, much in the same way that we forgot about Vietnam. But the skills that military leaders, and I think policy makers as well, require to succeed or to have the best chance of success in our wars or staying out of wars are the same in both types, big wars and little wars. Perspective taking, which Hannah Arendt of political theories described as training the mind to go visiting. The ability of a military officer at a high level, of a civilian policymaker at a high level, to put themselves in the shoes of other actors looking at the same situation is integral to good strategic work. Whether you're dealing with counterinsurgency, humanitarian assistance, development aid, or large wars. It's a critical skill. How often is it practiced? How mindfully are we aware of this skill and what it entails? Ask an advocate who talks about perspective taking. We call this strategic empathy. How do you do it? How do you gain the perspective of others? How do you train the mind of others? It's an interesting question. We can talk about it in the healing. Thank you very much for your time. We look forward to your questions and comments.
We definitely have time for Q&A. Since this is being filmed, I would ask that you pass the mic so we can pick it up on the video. Thank you. General Perez was very successful in his sector. What makes me wonder, is $1,000 bill more important than $1,000 bullet in counterinsurgency? You're okay.
Oh, okay, good. Okay. It's okay. I'll hold it. So you're asking if money is more important than bullets in a counterinsurgency? There's a scholar, Jacqueline Hazelton, who has a book about this very topic. She criticizes the population-based approach, population-centric approach to counterinsurgency, the hearts and minds approach that I described in this paper, saying that we need to stop thinking about it this way. What really matters is giving money, coalition building, local politics on the ground, but not necessarily by military leaders. But this is how you defeat a counterinsurgency, and probably by being more brutal. So you're saying that Perez was successful, and this is when he was commander surrounding Mosul. Yeah, it's money. Money. Yeah. I can't dispute that. And success has to be enduring. So when, if you have an improvement in the narrative, because you give money, how long is that going to last? We saw with the Cambridge engagements, you turn the spigot off, people switch sides. So how do you succeed in this kind of war? And this is probably the biggest thing. Remember, I wanted to ask policymakers, if you could re-engineer the intervention, how would you do it to get a better outcome? Because I don't have a good taste in my mouth with respect to Iraq, definitely Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen. None of these bring joy to my heart. And so we had trouble defeating Taliban with rifles and mortars and rockets. How is it going to work against the people who live in China when we have artificial intelligence and hypersonic missiles and advanced weaponry in play? It's be like I'm going to be writing a novel. Other questions? Yes.
Thank you. I'll take the opportunity that we also have been asked about. So, Dr. Perez, thank you very much for your discussion. I'm going to let the cynic in me come out and ask you a challenging question. So, the accounts of Colonel Brennan in Fishback. These are two perhaps unicorns in terms of their maturity of judgment, their desire to understand and appreciate in the midst of combat. And these are, top 5% officers who are perhaps uniquely suited to do the perspective taking that you described. And it was difficult even for them. So what real prospect is there? Should we integrate this kind of education and understanding at every level, at every echelon of education for our military professionals? What is the real prospect that the average among us is going to be able to put these things into practice and be effective?
That's a good question. Thanks, Steve. I think that it's one thing to learn about the complexities within these kinds of wars. It's another to succeed at them. One of the roles of the military leader at any level is to proper military advice. So you can think of military leaders having two roles. One of them is participating in ordnance delivery. How do we use our weapon systems or support our weapon systems in various missions? There's one task. Huntington called that the management of violence. But the other task is military advice. Whether it's from a major to a battalion commander, lieutenant colonel, or whether it's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to the Secretary of Defense of the President of the United States. I think it's fully possible for every military leader, starting at the earliest level, soon after graduating from a commissioning source, to learn about the complexities of Civil War. Just read a couple papers. And you'll see, wow, that was tough. Okay, next time, several years down the road, there's talk about doing another counterinsurgency. And these same leaders, having familiarized themselves with the difficulty of counterinsurgency, can say, hey, is this side switching going to be going on here? Because it doesn't happen everywhere. But is it going to be going on in this case? And if it is, how are we going to prepare our leaders? And even if they're well prepared, like Fishback and ground work, does that mean we're still going to succeed? These are great questions to ask, because the soldiers are going to come from places like Poland. That's how important the task is. There was a paper that was written by a scholar of civil wars. His name is Celestino. And he wrote a paper later, but the paper was published in 2003. Had a fancy name, something like the Ontology of Political Awareness. So automatically, with ontology in the title, no military person is going to pick it up on term. I discovered, my specialty is political theory, so Aristotle to Foucault and then I came back from Iraq and I discovered kaleidoscopic. And I was angry. It's like, oh my God, this is great. This 2003 paper would have been much better preparation than reading counterinsurgency doctrine or the train-ups that we all units went through before going halfway through the surge of 2007, March 2007, to 2008. It would have been less training. And even after saying this, in many forums, there was still a little appetite for integrating political science into military education. But what Taliban described is, as you get out in any location in the Civil War throughout space and time, Jonathan historians work, the fighting that's occurring in any one locality is loosely related to what he called the master cleavage, North versus South, government versus Taliban, etc., that was going on at the large scale. So if you're from Kansas and Missouri, I forget, a colleague's name Stevenson wrote a book, Leavenworth, but he said that there's like 6 different wars going on in the Kansas, Missouri area during the Civil War, loosely related to what was going on north versus south and the reasons for that war. And this is what civil wars do. They let loose this violence that people can exploit for different reasons. Some people are trying to survive, but other people are trying to get rich.
Yeah, I'm curious, it seemed like the Vietnam War was at least presented as a much more bipolar situation without this shifting of vision. Was that truly a difference there, or is there a difference in cultures, or did we just do that know how it was a kaleidoscopic situation as well?
Is anybody an expert on the Taliban's rights about Vietnam? And it was much more complicated in terms of the different religious groupings and the relationship on it. Took you were to like just you apply the ethno-linguistic map to Vietnam. It was much more complicated than we thought, even in very racist ways. Everybody looks alike. And you know the names that the American Service members call. But it was much more varied. And then you had criminal networks that my students look at Vietnam for the first deep dive exercises they do. And there was all kinds of stakeholders that were.
Was it a mosaic or a kaleidoscope?
It was a kaleidoscope.
Kaleidoscope.
But I think that maybe Iraq and Afghanistan, where if there's variation, maybe it was higher on it. In some countries, they're not as high. But that would require a study that I haven't done. Like what you're doing too.
Just to follow on there, Vietnam War, was it that we had the military capability to succeed and we understood much of what we needed to do to succeed, but we couldn't overcome the political force working against the military?
There's a whole scholarship on why Vietnam leads another example of strategic discontent for U.S. forces. I'll bring up an example of one of the things we try to do is bomb the North numerous times, pound them in, thinking that this would cause the other side to fail. But what we find repeatedly is that this kind of pressure, even on civilians, doesn't work. The people are resilient, and they won't work. And given the number of forces that the North Vietnamese had at their disposal, and given the reality of what the Americans had and were willing to commit to Vietnam, there's experts here in the room who could speak, more with more depth about that, but I don't see how that would have succeeded. I don't see it. And it didn't succeed. So the question is why.
Yeah, it seems that there's something, at least in my mind, that's missing. When Americans go overseas to do whatever it is, interventions, counterinsurgency, there's a limited shelf life. And that unless the United States actually wants to be in Afghanistan or whatever country in almost perpetuity, there's no way that the United States could succeed in implanting a new form of government or establishing peace. When I think back to when the United States took the Philippines from Spain and decided to annex it, the United States was going to be there for the long term, and thereby employed some pretty ruthless techniques and in order to establish peaceable relations in the countryside. But even then, some of those districts were never fully pacified, but still the United States intended to keep the Philippines as something akin to a colony. So unless the United States political leadership decided to stay in Afghanistan for the next 20, 30, 40 years, it's simply a game with no chance of any success.
That's insightful and it's compelling. But then I wonder, what would those tours over several decades of American forces, and I'm going to Afghanistan, I'm lucky. Just graduated from West Point, and my first 3 stations gonna be as a platoon leader in Afghanistan. What would be the analog between, the troubles, and British forces there?
But Northern Ireland, part of the United Kingdom, there's no way British forces intend to leave unless they're granted autonomy, but they also have their own independent, their own actors within Ulster.
So for the larger audience, we talk about in the class that I teach, several of my students are here, is what is the political aim you want to achieve? Fundamental question. What is the military aim that's going to support it? What are the costs you're willing to pay? And then what is the resolve or the will that you have in order to pay those costs to achieve the political aim? These are fundamental questions. And you have to do your homework as a policymaker, as a senior military leader, to sort what those answers are. You're probably wrong. And then you have to figure out what the other side's themes, cost, and result is. And once you do that work, you can start to make assessments about what it would take to win. There was Shinseki, General Shinseki, who had warned, in order to do this kind of operation, you're going to need, what was it, hundreds of thousands of soldiers to achieve the right ratio, 400,000 to achieve the right ratio. I'm not certain that if you had 400,000 soldiers there, that would have made a difference. Because it's like saying you're going to stop political flood. You topple a regime, the Sunnis find out, oh, we're not in the majority. That's interesting. We're the minority. And we're about to be exterminated. There's implications here. This is Doug Ottowan's, analysis. I'm not sure that you could control those forces, or if you could, that there was going to be a lot of more deaths on American and coalition forces than you would have anticipated. This is speculation. That you don't want to.
Hey, Tino, great lecture. Big fan of Status Calamas here for sure. As you were talking, I was thinking about all the things, the lived experience that I had, and as many others here. I remember at the time we were talking about money as a weapon system. So we understood that we were buying influence as an intermediate military objective to buy space for time, if you will. If we can buy stability now, we give the government time to be established and those types of things. I remember doing two-year engagement briefings with General Brooks, and we knew the connection that the district police chief had with his wife being the sister of a known insurgent. So, kind of giving a little credit, I think we understood there were local dynamics. So the question being, after the speech, sorry, the question being, like, is there an intelligence function labs here where we get down to the tactical level? I know there was some, and actually not just talk, but actual action in terms of getting into intel professionals at the company level, the tactical level, to try to bridge that gap. Is there an intelligence function that we can do better to help us with all that local dynamics of war? I guess is the question.
I think intelligence has a critical role here, but they have to be reading the stuff that we're citing here. And I did read to you the political scientists who contribute to this. This is a whole other section. But if the intel, I have one here, obviously. If they're reading this work, it gives them something to look for when they're doing the intel work. Because those scholars, without classified data, are making causal connections, identifying different forces that you're simply not going to identify on the ground. On the other hand, the intel officers have classified information that the scholars will never have. Could you imagine if you combine the two? Well, this is important. Now, going back to money as a weapon system. When I heard that expression, it was, we need to have this money to pay the police forces, whether in Afghanistan or Iraq, so they can support the government, so they can have weapon systems, so they can have trucks, and they can have ammunition, so they can have some rudimentary training. But that's what the money was for. It wasn't, we need to pay them to stop shooting this, like bribes. And so, what is the money for? And the sense, at least in many places, according to the anecdotes that I'm reading, is that for many, it was simply payment, not the purpose. And the question becomes, is that the motive? And this is difficult to do. No one ever teaches us to read motives. This is why we need to study politics and not simply culture. In the military, we think of politics as a subset of culture. We read cultural little cards as we went to Afghanistan and Iraq, which were more about etiquette. Don't show the bottoms of your soles of your feet, to the person when you're talking. Well, that's not politics. Politics is, why do people do what they do, and who are the relevant actors? And anthropologists can do some of that, but that's not what they do. And it's not what the military leaders are accustomed to thinking about. We go back here, there's a bunch of
I just wanted to ask if you think, if you thought military tour should be longer. I mean, you clearly show that they have to practice local politics in a lot of cases. I think you would show that they need better training. They're faced sometimes with a daunting array of political and cultural problems. But of course, military tours just less up in here, and they're under pressure to show progress during that time. I mean, I've seen commanders or P.R.T. managers come in and just change things. Because maybe this will work. We tried that. Let's try that. And well, what do you think about rain pill?
No, definitely one of the unintended perverse outcomes of shorter tours is that you get a degradation of local knowledge over time. You have to relearn it every single time. So whether it's 15 months or 12 months or 6 months or something, you're learning the area again. One of the dangers was when we were doing this reconnaissance before we actually deployed, was a forward colonel who had already deployed to that area said, hey, so-and-so, local actor's still here. Yeah, but we're unsure about him. Oh, he's great. The guy who's coming in, who used to be there like over a year ago, is telling the current folks, he's a great guy. There's a hubris here. And then also every commander, when they took over it with different, grades, they would redo the plan, or the campaign plan, because they could. And now you're starting over. And the question is, how good is that transition? Well, the White House, we have a transition from one administration to the other. How good is the transition from one unit to another in terms of all those details? And is the will there to keep up the same sort of approach? Or did we learn something, when we went back to the United States and you train at home? But definitely, there's something to consider.
So I'm wondering, with these kaleidoscopic words, do you see, and maybe this would be different for each one, but do you see viable ways to re-engineer that on the ground for soldiers? Or is that like, maybe there needs to be a more radical shift in framework of deployment, or maybe that sets limits on what kind of words we do have to be engaged in, for example, or that sort of thing.
That's a separate question. If I could be in charge of the universe and go back in time with 2003 Iraq, I would never, don't do it. You don't need to open up that can of worms. You're involved in another war right now in Afghanistan. Why focus on this? I think this is pretty much conventional. Most people would agree with me. Because we put soldiers in a very difficult position. Having said that, I don't know how we could have succeeded. I'm not optimistic, looking back, they could have been done, better with it. Now, Afghanistan, I would go back and say, instead of like going and toppling the Taliban, maybe we just let them be. And we go after, the people who are responsible for 9/11 attacks as, law enforcement and using special forces, special operations to kill, as we identify where these people are. But instead of going to war, that may have been a better option, and we would have avoided, 20 years of war in Afghanistan and the departure of the suffering. But we need to think through these things because this consequence of this military teaches us that passion, hatred, and enmity get in the way. Or kind of make cold calculations about where our political and military are, and what cost we're under there. It's easier to say vengeance, but vengeance doesn't make any sense rationally as any kind of strategy, as a political aim. Okay, you got your vengeance now, you're still back. And so we need to think through these issues with due diligence. But it's a great question. You'd have to convince me that it's possible. What I want military leaders to say as they advise civilians and higher level leaders is, this is really difficult, are you sure you want to do it? And then we work through the analysis, but it requires analysis.
Actually, this is a very interesting topic, and when you introduce this in the class, I've been thinking about it ever since. There was something that came to my mind, and it picks up from the thought that came about tenures. We have been in India fighting insurgency for 30 years now, and I remember 90s was the time when we had something like a similar problem, people switching sides and we could make out who's who. But over a period of time, people stopped complaining about this. I would hear people talking about this, and I have been thinking ever since our class, what happened? I think, and it may not be relevant to US, I'm just giving an input, maybe it may be of some use. It was not intended to be so. It was not done for this particular reason. It was a basic HR problem that somebody was trying to solve. The tenures of Indian soldiers in counterinsurgency operations for officers and enlisted men, 3 years. A terrorist's lifespan in an intense counterinsurgency area is 1 to 3 years. So, and every year we change 1/3 of people who are deployed. So there's a continuity. So a terrorist in his politics cannot outlive the person, the officer who's sitting here. He outlives him. He is, I think at this point of time, because with what you've set me thinking, I'm going to apply it for 2 and 2 together, and this whole issue of tenure, we are smarter than him, those who are sitting there on this one. Maybe there is some merit to this. I don't know how right or how wrong it is. I thought it's an input I should give it to you.
No, in fact, thank you. That definitely solves the problem of one knowledge, or at least it damages it quite a bit. And now would be interested in seeing, are the other dynamics that they encountered, were they present in the tactical level, in the insurgency that you're describing, that you participated in? And I would, no, that's an explanation. This is called institutional analysis. How do we design the rule sets with which we do governance or we go to war? And it makes a difference. 3 years or 1 year or 6 months as an effect. Thank you.
I'll wait until, I hope nobody else has questions. So, Tino, I love what you've done, I love Richard Langton work on. And the thing that goes through my head when you do this is that this is not hard for Americans. It's kind of, so humility is the first word that jumps to mind. How stupid do you have to be, or how arrogant do you have to be, to not see another society similar to our own? It's like, can you imagine the Russians or the Chinese saying, hey, let's engineer the 2016 election, or the 2020 election, or the 2024 election? And we would say, no, we can kind of watch. How many of us in the military would have understood who would win the 2016, the 2020, or the 2024 election? And yet we somehow assume we can understand another society in a cardboard way that is nothing like how American political system actually works. So there's a part of me wonders, so when I hear what you say, what about political science, is there a certain basic, political empathy that says, our society is unpredictable, we haven't solved our own civil war that ended in 1865. And a lot of the major issues, why do we assume other societies can be changed at the, clap of the hands, snap of the finger? So this is not a heavy intellectual exercise, this is a basic human empathy. Can you actually see other people as being like us?
If someone visits Carlisle, a friend, I can take them to any number of restaurants. I know where they are. I know the ones I like. I know the streets. If I want to ride my bike, I know where there's some trails, things at college. I know if I want to watch a college soccer game, where to go. I know where the law school is. So I know Carlisle. I know nothing about Carlisle. I don't know who the prominent business people are, who the prominent contractors are. I don't know who the professors are with a lot of influence in the educational, where we are here in Dickinson Law School. I don't know where the illicit flows of narcotics and God forbid, human trafficking, if they come through here at all, or where they do. I don't know what the principal criminal problems are that police face on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. I don't know what the big disputes are on the agenda politically within Colorado. I don't know what Colorado's relationship is to any other political entity, community near here. I don't understand what the rules. So that's politics. If you really want to be able to navigate Colorado, you have to know that stuff. And so to show up, carrying your weapon system and walking around and talking to people, taking off your glasses because it's a polite thing to do, and trying to make friends. Well, there's going to be people who are friendly to you. There's going to be some people who speak English. There's going to be an affinity. You'll be invited to their homes. But none of that really matters. Or it might happen. It probably doesn't. So then how do you become a politician on the ground, being able to win coalitions against enemies, whether in a friendly way or in a lethal way? And this is why I'm hesitant when people, for good reasons, want to say that the military is political, but it's not partisan. Politics to me is this much deeper thing than I think the people who want to advocate that separation between politics and partisanship, I think you can't do that. The essence to the people I read as a political theorist of politics is partisanship. Unfortunately, it's Carl Schmitt, the fascist legal thinker, supporter of National Socialism. Some people think like him. Some people think that the essence of politics is us versus them, and them need to die. And we can reject Carl Schmitt, and we should, but that idea is something that people actually hold. And military people are the ones who are going to confront that reality. And so this is the essence of politics. It's hard work. It's like going to East LA and looking up the gangs there and saying, you don't want to bring gang violence down to zero. And we're just going to walk around as outsiders and do all the counterinsurgency things, sit down with different gang members and try to give money and, build relationships between them. It's hard. It's hard to do. So I'm skeptical that it can be done. Going back to your question, I don't even know if it can. But these are the questions that we need to sort out with the mouse before we go. Richard, I hope that was satisfactory. I do want to thank the Sherwood Wickedness Project, War, Peace, and Justice, for creating this kind of forum. We value democracy, government by the people, and that requires citizens be informed of what's going on within their military, within other spheres of government. And it's only through forums like this, and this was his vision, Jordan Guinness and Scott's vision several years ago, and to see what you've created, the space, in several different events, is just wonderful to see. So thank you very much to both of you for what you've done here. But to everyone here, thank you very much for coming. These are interesting times. And so I think that it's easy to say, I don't want to watch the news, I don't want to be involved. I think it's at these times that we have to really be involved, and watch what's going on, because if you don't, so thank you very much, and, thank you.
Before everybody leaves, I just have a few comments. I just returned from the UK about 2 weeks ago. And I go there every year, and this particular time I was left on the 31st of October. But already you saw the veterans, British veterans out on the streets handing out poppies. When I left Paddington Station, go to Heathrow, 31st, the King's military band was there playing to thousands of passengers. Every service was in uniform handing out poppies. And they still do it on the 11th hour, 11th day, 11th month. They stand still for 2 minutes and reflect on their sacrifices that their men and women and civilians gave their lives over centuries of war. Very important. And I think what's important about tonight, this is my second time listening to Tino. We talk about civil military relations, but this is really about civil military interaction. And I think it's important that, we subscribe to the Constitution, we the people, and we need to be involved. And we need to understand what happened over the longest war in U.S. history in Afghanistan, also Iraq, before we go into future endeavors. And as parents send our sons and daughters into harm's way. My son's a Special Forces operator in the Marine Corps. He's deploying in January to a place unknown. Not worried, I'm concerned. He's got a great head on his shoulders, but we need to be supportive of them. We need to challenge our elected officials, our senior leadership, so we can understand before our young men and women sacrifice their lives, sometimes needlessly, and sometimes for good reason. But again, thank you for everybody. I would be remiss. I want, on behalf of Bill Flavin, our current project director, thank you for coming tonight. And I would also be remiss by not saying and thanking our sponsor, which is Core Christie Institute. They provide, everything we do is free and open to the public. And they pay for everything. They're very generous, and we're very thankful they have them as supporters. Their primary mission is the renewal of ethics, moral leadership, and spirituality in vocations. So I want to thank all our partners again in Core Christie and everyone for coming tonight. Tino's going to hang around for a while, I think. So we have refreshments left, some food. So please indulge. Thank you very much. Oh, by the way, if you want to sign up, we have a distribution list, a yellow piece of paper back there if you want to leave your email. We send out announcements about 2 weeks prior to the event and about 3 days prior. Everybody's blank copies, so your email will not be compromised. And please check out what we've done in the past. As I mentioned, the back table, this is our 36th session for the last 2 years, and we're going to continue as long as the money holds up and as long as we get wonderful patronage like this. Thank you very much.